What's up, Seekers? Welcome back. Thank you for joining me for this live reading of Plotinus Enneads. I don't know how far we'll get, but we will get started and we'll have fun together. It's a great book. Hey, Füsun, thanks for joining us. I hope you guys can hear me and see me well. The plan is that we're going to start reading together from the introductions, and we will start with the introductions, and then we will get to the main body of the text itself. The body of the text is notoriously a difficult one, so I think that the introduction will help us. Hey, Hal. Also, this is not going to be, I know it's a serious book, but it's not going to be a very serious reading. I think we're going to be here to have fun and be a little silly, and we're going to do a book club out of this. Hell yeah, says Primanders. So feel free to chuck in your insights, your jokes, your questions, and we're going to have fun and do this together. We are reading the Enneads, and is the Penguin edition translated by Stephen Mackenna, the proud Irish. And if you see here, he begins with this great quote here: "To the glory of God and the honor of Ireland, Stephen Mackenna." So I think I'm going to, I had a bit of a flip around to see where to start over here. And I think I would like to start, there's a little biographical sketch about Mackenna in the beginning, but I think we're going to skip that. Anyone who wants can read that themselves. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me well? I think we're going to start on page XLII, The Place of Plotinus in the History of Thought. It's a great title for an introduction by Paul Henry. And ASMR says it's my birthday, and this is how they're spending their evening. That is so awesome. Glad to have you. Happy birthday. Glad to have you here spending your birthday with us. Glad for the channel and all the other pals and religious studies here on YouTube. Yeah, thank you so much. Happy birthday. I hope this is a fun way to spend your birthday together with all of us here, and I'm glad you're enjoying the channel. Alram says it's on their reading list, but happy to be doing it. I think as well, like, this is on my reading list, and I don't know if I would ever be reading it properly if I wasn't doing it with you guys and girls. So here we are doing it together. Happy birthday to you. Okay, we will begin then, and feel free to interrupt with any questions, thoughts, readings of your own. We're going to read at a nice slow pace and digest it and have fun with it. The Place of Plotinus in the History of Thought. Void Being says that this is terrible to see someone reading from the Penguin edition, that the Armstrong translation is better. Listen, this is the one we have, so this is the one we're going to do. Apparently, this one is a bit more of a loose translation, so it is going to be a bit more readable, even if it's a bit less accurate technically, perhaps. So there's always a pick-up over there. All right. Plotinus holds a very important place in the history of thought. Important in philosophy, more important in theology, and in the development of mysticism. Is that right? Ooh, we read one sentence. Okay, be serious. Heir to the great philosophies of the ancient world, those of Plato, Aristotle, and Stoics, he borrowed from all of them the insights which he needed, but without surrendering at any point the dominant influence of Platonism. Right, so Plotinus, the father of Neoplatonism, obviously drawing heavily from Plato, and he feels himself that he's an interpreter of Plato, but of course he's drawing as well from Aristotle and the Stoics. I'm going to read about all of these influences here in the introduction. I read ahead just a little just to check what we were getting. Eclectic in appearance, but powerfully unified by the strength of a single pervading impulse. His system has, by various channels, often obscure and often indirect, come to be and remained one of the guiding forces in the thought of the West, whether Christian or secular, from Augustine and Scotus Regina to Dean Ing and Berson. whoever wrote this introduction, Paul Henry, seems to think that there's only Christian philosophy in the West. Judaism and Islam just don't exist as far as this introduction goes. So, and you'll see that popping up time and time again. He is the last great philosopher of antiquity, and yet in more than one respect, and notably in the sense, and notably in the stress which he places on the autonomy of spirit, he is a precursor of modern times. So seeing him both as the last great philosopher of antiquity, and yet also the last of the old, the first of the new. All right, what is happening here? Hearing and seeing me clearly, nice. This guy can't even read. That is correct. I am dyslexic, and you're going to bear with a guy who can't even read. Reading is terrible, terribly difficult to read. Good. He is in the West the founder of that speculative mysticism, which expresses intellectual, or rather super intellectual and negative categories, the stages and states of union with the absolute. It is a mysticism wholly philosophical, transposed in a new key, which is specifically Platinian, and it differs very greatly from the mysticism of St. Paul and John, with which through the centuries it runs parallel or combines, often almost unconsciously, although at times also in conflict with the gospel mysticism. So, as I said, Christian gospel mysticism is going to play such a role in this introduction, and it's going to be just juxtaposing the thought of Plotinus against early Christian thought, which is going to be an interesting part of the story of Platonism and Plotinus, obviously. Voice is a bit crackly. I wonder if that's me or internet. The haters are just here for haterade. Okay. Porphyry published the works of his master Plotinus, 204 to 270, at the beginning of the 4th century in 301 AD. That is to say, just when Christianity was about to become, under Constantine, the official religion of the empire, and when, above all, Christian thought was about to reflect in the full light of day, through its theologians and its councils, upon the biblical revelation, and to set the task, while remaining faithful to that revelation, of expressing it in new terms. So the formulation of Plotinus's philosophy comes at a very opportune time for Christianity. The focus of this introduction, when Christianity began to articulate its own revelation in philosophical terms, and it's going to be done in parallel to and in conversation with the theology and philosophy of Plotinus. Someone says Judaism is certainly not a Western religion. Okay, interesting. Jewish mysticism is in line with Sufism. Greece gave birth to the West. Boyd says, are you seriously reading a preface? Yes, we are. If you don't want to be here, you're welcome to leave. Thank you very much. 10 centuries of the Middle Ages, though knowing nothing of the Enneads of Plotinus, remained paradoxically enough only through the meditations of St. Augustine and the Pseudo-Dionysius, closely dependent upon his thought, his being Plotinus. Of St. Thomas Aquinas, Dean Ing could write, not without exaggeration, but with some plausibility, that he was nearer to Plotinus than to the real Aristotle. The Renaissance, in the person of Marcello Ficino, rediscovered his works and was enthralled by his teacher. Later, such religious thinkers as the Cambridge Platonists, such as the philosophers Berkeley and Hegel, and poets Novalis and Goethe, interested themselves in him, in Plotinus, and contributed by this interest towards the creation of an atmosphere in which his works, having been edited, translated, and explained, are no more obscure than those of the many-sided Aristotle or their common master, the divine Plato. Right, Plato, throughout the Middle Ages, by both Muslims, Jews, and Christians, is called divine Plato, Platon Halaki, Plato Divinitas, and tracing here the reception through the Middle Ages to the Renaissance to the modern period of the philosophy of Plotinus. Okay. It is not the aim of this introduction to discuss, for their own sake, the themes, even the essential ones, of Plotinus' thought. This thing has already been done many times excellently, and he quotes here in the footnote Ing, Armstrong, and many others who have done that. The most we can do is to seize upon certain controversial but characteristic points which may help us to determine his proper historical setting. It may, in other words, be of interest to consider him as a link in an unbroken chain which extends from Plato to Bergson, Henry Bergson, French vitalist philosopher, as a thinker inspired by his predecessors and by the God who is in him, and in turn inspiring many of those who came after him. At the risk of, I think what I'll do is I'll read one paragraph and then I'll stop and look at the comments and then interact and go back and forth that way. We're figuring out a system here. Nice. At the risk of often simplifying extremely complex problems, and yet without being able always to exhibit the detailed reasons in support of opinions sometimes summarily expressed, we have to try and uncover the time-honored themes which were inherited from Greece and above all from Plato. Were transmuted by creating interest in Plotinus' own epoch and by personal genius, and which went on to impress themselves deeply upon certain abiding tradition of Western thought. So he's not going to try and sort and present all of the core themes of Plotinus, but simply to see the themes that he's taking from Plato and seeing how he's passing them on into the reception of Western philosophical historical thought. I see there's a whole bunch of people here watching with us. There's 30 plus people together here. This is great fun. I hope you all have your books and you're cozy and in for a good read with us. Let us see what is happening here in the chat. Oh, look who's here. It is Philip Home from Let's Talk Religion. Philip, I wanted to try and bring you on the stream, but I've had no idea how to get the stream together. If you can let me know how to do that, please jump on this with me. Happy here. Kate says, appreciate taking time to do this. Nice. Protagonist is here, defending against the haters. Thank you. I think that the Greeks at that time considered themselves part of these civilizations, and we would consider the Eastern. Interesting. This question of East versus West is a hot one in the. Someone said that they look forward to Philip's talk on Islamic Neoplatonism, but it is still a mystery and a surprise what it's going to be coming up, so we don't know. Oh, the audio is not great. I'm sorry to hear about that. Many blessings from blah blah. All right, back to the stream. If he had been able to foresee and to measure in advance his influence on the Christian or de-Christianized West, he would have attributed entirely to the exceptional and indeed, in his view, unique value of the authentic Platonism of Plato. Right, this point that Plotinus doesn't see himself as an innovative thinker, he sees himself as simply retelling that which Plato was trying to transmit. A Plato not transmuted and transposed, but rediscovered and revitalized. It is not rare for great philosophers to claim the authority of an illustrious predecessor and to ensure survival through the power of their own creative genius, acting in a spirit of loyalty without servility. Aristotelianism itself, in a sense, the most formidable adversary of Plato, and his disciple Plotinus, lives on in large areas of Western thought, notably in Western theology, through the influence of St. Thomas Aquinas, who, it may be added, was perhaps more strongly tinged with Platonism than he often himself realized. So this theme of great philosophers being held up by further great philosophers throughout history who at least present themselves as doing nothing but passing on the thoughts of the early philosopher is not a crazy idea. Perhaps, let's see what's happening here. Thank you, Mark. Good to have you here. Perhaps it is characteristic of certain great philosophers of originality and power to associate themselves closely with a great predecessor whose work they can recapture without merely reproducing it, and can transcend while never abandoning it. Interesting. It is perhaps this creative loyalty which gives to the term philosophia perennis whatever meaning it may possess. This desire that we see during the Renaissance, and in some ways earlier, of trying to harken back to the great thought of the ancients and to merely be a voice putting them forward, while of course doing a lot with that without taking so much credit. Plotinus, Augustine, and St. Thomas occupy in this respect similar positions in the history of thought, and perhaps we may include in their company Plato himself, if we remember his obscure but well-attested relationship with the Pythagoreans and, of course, with Socrates. So this thing of a great philosopher merely being here to pass on the work of a great philosopher before him, Plotinus is doing to Plato, but Plato, of course, is also doing it in some ways to Socrates and to Pythagoras. Jeff says that soul is used in the sense of spirit. We will think of that for the point we'll get there in a second. Since it is largely through Christian thought that Plotinus, like Aristotle, has continued to influence the thought of the West, we shall expect not only to underline the continuity of Plotinus's Hellenism and Christian thought, but also to indicate where in crucial matters they part company. So both where Christianity and Plotinus agree and disagree. It will then be seen, even though the point cannot be elaborated, how, in certain respects, Christian values, secularized and detached from their original context, sometimes revert to the pure rationalism or the mystical rationalism of Plotinus' Platonism, and sometimes, as in certain types of phenomenology and existentialism, remain on the philosophical plane, nearer to the Aristotelian and Judeo-Christian tradition than to the Greek idealism of Plato and Plotinus. So those are kind of the poles that, what's this guy's name? That Paul Henry is going to be dancing between. Whether or not we agree with them, that is what he's setting out for us here. Section number 1, Socrates and the soul. It is not easy to say precisely what Plotinus owes to Socrates. Socrates' teaching is difficult to reconstitute, and Plotinus, even more than ourselves, knew it only through the dialogues of Plato. So that his debt to Socrates is a debt to Plato. Moreover, he scarcely refers to him and never invokes his authority. It is true that Socrates was perhaps the first man in Europe who had a clear and coherent conception of the soul as we understand it. That is, as the moral and intellectual personality, the responsible agent in knowing and acting rightly or wrongly. Then Plotinus, along with almost the whole of Greek philosophy, and with Plato in particular, owes to Socrates the very center of his thought, the notion of the soul as conceptualized as such. At the beginning of his career, Plotinus' career, in his treatise on the immortality of the soul, he observes that whether we adhere to the Platonic tradition in which the body is the soul's instrument, or to the Aristotelian in which the soul is the body's form or act, the essential human being, as identified with what we nowadays would call his ego or self, is never the composite, which is the body and the soul, but always the soul, that is the essence of the person. Thus, at one stroke, Plotinus is in opposition to the biblical and Judeo-Christian conception, which declines to recognize any fundamental opposition, even a logical one, between soul and body. Interesting. So, Mr. Henry is positing a dichotomy between the Greek thought of Socrates, which Plotinus inherits, and that of the biblical traditions, which he's saying, according to Socrates and then to Plato and Plotinus, the soul is something other than the body, and separate from it, and it is the core of the human personality and identity, and the moral locus of the decision making. Whereas for the what he calls the biblical and Judeo-Christian, this duality and dichotomy between body and soul does not exist. Interesting. Jeff says body plus spirit equals soul. This is fundamental. The conception of the soul as the seat of the personality prepares the way for Christianity. And the fact that Plotinus, following Socrates and Plato, concentrates his teaching on this cardinal point goes perhaps some way to explain the deep-seated influence which he exercised on the first Christian thinkers and on the mystical tradition of the West. Nevertheless, this very idealism, this spiritual egoism, accentuates the difference between even a Hellenized form of Christianity and Hellenism pure and simple. Neither Socrates nor Plato took sufficient note of the will factor. In their teaching, there is no place, as moreover there is none in Aristotle, for sin and plenary responsibility, for full responsibility for the individual. In this matter, Plotinus strove unsuccessfully, as he realized, to bring harmony into the contradictory affirmations of Plato. On the one hand, the soul, according to Plato, is free, self-impelled, responsible in its fall, and in the desire, he puts fall here in quotations, which is why I made air quotes, and in the desire to belong to itself, isolated from the whole and from its source. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, its descent is necessary for ensuring the government, life, and ordering of the universe. Briefly, we have the categorical assertion, without any adequate explanation, of the ego and the universal order. So what are we saying here? Will someone summarize for us? Mr. Cranium says the privileged status of moral intelligence and the frontier of psychosocial development. Let's continue a little. The essential doctrine of Socrates is that virtue is knowledge. One second. This conception of the soul that Plotinus is inheriting from Plato, according to this introduction, paves the way for Christian thought, although it's going to be different, obviously, from pure Hellenized thought. What is missing in Socrates and Plato, according to this instruction, is the factor of will, sin, and responsibility. On the other hand, Plotinus is trying to harmonize contradictions that he finds in Plato. That on the one hand, the soul is free agent, separate from the rest of existence, not tied into the order of reality. On the other hand, the soul descends into the order of the universe, between what he calls the ego and the universal order, and that is a contradiction in the thought of Plato that Plotinus is going to reconcile when it comes to the question of the soul. Right, to what extent does Plotinus's soul is defined by it? The central doctrine of Socrates is that virtue is knowledge. Plotinus agrees. The intellect with which the soul, intellect here with a capital I, of course, with which the soul in the higher phase of its life is identified, is without sin and strictly incapable of sinning. Vice is not a perversion of intelligence, but a condition in which this activity is absent or dormant. Wrongdoing is not so much rebellion and defiance as bewilderment and weariness. He's quoting here from Jean Toulard to summarize the thought of Plotinus, which is going to be quite different, as we'll see from Christian thought. Where wrongdoing Where wrongdoing simply does not exist, there can of course be a place either for pardon and expiation or for salvation, which are of course so central to the Christian doctrine. Such notions or values imply an absolute freedom, which Plotinus denies to the soul and denies to the divinity, whether as identified with the one, which is his absolute, or with the intellect and the universal soul. Penance and repentance give place to forgetfulness. Right? So it's not a question of the person doing the one, willfully doing the wrong thing of perversion. It's just a question of the absence of intellect, or a blindness of the intellect, we could say. So penance and repentance give place to forgetfulness. The contrast with the biblical revelation and with certain lines of thought in the ancient Near East is complete. Where the Christian sees tragic contradiction, the Neoplatonist diagnoses a weakness or incapacity. It is significant that Platonian mysticism, though so negative and so demanding, acknowledges neither disquiet nor anguish, nor the darkness, nor the night of the soul, nor the night of the spirit of Paul, of Gregory of Nyssa, of Augustine, Teresa of Avila, of John of the Cross. Denudation is not sacrifice. For the Alexandrian, Plotinus, as for Socrates, complete attention and perfect consent, far from being the conditions of sin, make any offense impossible. Spirit cannot sin. Wrongdoing in Plotinus is perhaps allied to the Buddhist conception of wrongdoing or to Spinoza's doctrine of the inadequate idea. So there is no capacity for the individual to sin against their purpose or against God. All that can simply happen is that they can be unaware of what their true reality is, an absence of knowledge as opposed to a darkness which is brought on by sin and negativity. What is happening here in the comment section, you good people? This contradiction Plotinus is tackling, says Mark, seems like a much older version of the mind-body problem. Interesting. Got to start with the letters. This introduction, really hardcore frames Plotinus as a Christian. Yes. It is very much a framing. It is very much a framing in terms of Christianity. It's funny as well because it's almost being done. I mean, to a degree, it's conscious, and to a degree, it's not really subconscious. Like they write, for example, Paul Henry writes, 10 centuries of the Middle Ages, there know nothing of Enneads, when he should have written 10 centuries of the Christian Middle Ages. That's what he's talking about. But we will note that, and we will keep that in mind for now. Jeff is fully invested. Nice. Spinoza's inadequate idea. Appreciate the equation of sin and error. Mark tends to share that as well. Oh, we have Mr. Johnson getting ahead of us already into the book itself. Okay. Furthermore, despite a number of stoicizing affirmations to the contrary, and the adoption of the doctrine of universal sympathy, man is for Plotinus fundamentally isolated. He is not, as he is for Aristotle, and perhaps even for Plato and the laws, a political animal. There are not in the Enneads divine sources of morality and religion. In the pursuit of happiness, in the search for God, society has no place. The sage is a monad, basically unrelated to any other monad. No solidarity exists of man with man, whether in good or in evil. How different from Judaism and Christianity, in which the doctrine of original sin, so difficult for Greek rationalism, plays a fundamental part. It's interesting. It's very interesting to hear Plotinus filtered through Paul Henry and his own conception of what Judeo-Christianity is. Fascinating. Finally, salvation is not to be achieved. Interesting. This is an important line. Salvation is not to be achieved. It is achieved. As in, it's there already. For its realization, it is enough that the individual should become conscious of what he already is in his innermost nature. Right? This idea that we just need to recognize that we are already redeemed, that we don't need to go through a process of being redeemed. Where intellect, which is beyond the virtues, identifies itself with the true being and with the idea which one forms of the self, of the world, and of God. So salvation is simply the intellect, the higher part of the soul, as you said earlier, identifying itself with being, with the true forms, ultimately with God, with the one. What is happening here? Mr. Johnson says that they wrote, or Miss Johnson, S.C. Johnson wrote that they wrote their undergrad thesis on Plotinus. So sorry if they spoil anything. You have to write a spoiler warning if you're going to write something, which is from the end of the book. Okay. The incarnatism of the soul and of God excludes at once all sacramentalism and all true history of becoming. Latent actuality of salvation and the cold transcendence of God make it impossible, in terms of Platonian Socratism, to conceive of any genuine doctrine of grace. So here again, framing it in contrast to Christianity, where we don't have a process of salvation. We simply have a ever-present salvation which we need to be made aware of. This sort of outlook, which is really not so much arrogant as individualistic and intellectualist, has strongly influenced, and in view of the gospel message, perhaps unduly, some Christian ascetics who, following in the footsteps of Plotinus, have sought salvation in flight and union with God in solitude. So you can see he's not so happy with Christian mystics who follow a Platonian mysticism. He wants them to be deeply rooted in what he understands to be the message of the Gospels, which is that salvation is in the process of redeeming us from sin in time, in real progress that needs grace, not just some sort of realization of the true state of the intellect. By and large, however, that Socratic heritage, which is the conviction of the existence, that Socratic heritage, which is the conviction of the existence and supreme dignity of the human soul as a traveler in eternity and an amphibian hovering between two worlds, which is Plotinus's description, the heritage which was rethought by Plato and transposed by Plotinus into a mysticism more rational or rationalistic than religious, was on the way to cementing a centuries-long alliance with the gospel revelation, and through it, with virtually all the great philosophies of the West. All the great philosophies of the West, which, of course, are directly related to the Gospels, because only Christianity is an important philosophy as far as this introduction goes, which, though often freed from theological tutelage, were nevertheless born on Christian soil. The philosophies, let us say, of Thomas Aquinas and Spinoza, of Descartes and of Kant. It is only in our own day that we see influential schools of empiricism and behaviorism, Marxism, logical positivism, existentialism, all deviating from the Platonic tradition and from Christian intellectualism, deviation which is perhaps their only common denominator. All right, that's that section on Plotinus and Socrates and the soul. The next is going to be the ideas and the God of Plato. Let us see what is happening here. Marx says that redemption is already achieved. Marx reminds him of the Buddhist idea that we're all already enlightened, we just don't know it. Yes, I think he also makes a bit of a reference here to Buddhism, right? We said earlier the Buddhist conception of wrongdoing, but you're also right to draw that to the Buddhist conception of redemption. Universal salvation is described as being designed for every soul is entangled in the wheel, referring to Buddhism, I take it. This intro feels like it was written to troll me specifically. I don't think Plotinus redemption, already a Christian term, is as much a non-process as this characterization. Yes, listen, I'm not saying that the introduction is right, but we will read it because it may be helpful to get to the text, and it may be interesting to contrast the text against what the introduction has to say. And Mackenna says that I'd love a summary reflection between the sections if it isn't too annoying for you to do. Oh yes, we can. I think we can summarize. What are we saying here then? We are saying that we're opening up this question of what Plotinus' relationship is to the soul, inheriting the tradition of the soul as he does from Socrates and from Plato, and the contradictions that are involved in there as well, and then trying to understand what is the place of the soul and what is its relationship to salvation and redemption. And he's saying that for Plotinus, the soul is something which stands apart from reality. It's a monad which does not interact with other individuals, other souls, and doesn't have a process of sin and redemption as we found in Christianity. Rather, it is the role of the soul is simply to recognize its true identity with the intellect, with the one, and in doing so, it is automatically recognizing its own true salvation. And this tradition of the soul, this beautiful, the soul is the amphibian between two worlds, is going to impact all of great Western philosophy, Aquinas, Spinoza, Descartes, Kant, and we'll see the shift in the modern period where these ideas are no longer held as the ground, as the bedrock of philosophy. Mark says I appreciated running commentary. I'm glad I can read along and think along with you guys. Ram says that he's afraid that reading the introduction will taint the way that the book is going to be read. I think you can read an introduction and hold it as an introduction and allow the book to stand for itself as well. I don't think there's too much of a reason to fear. Okay, section number 2. The ideas and the God of Plato. There's still a whole nice crowd of people here. Over 25 people here reading with us. I didn't expect this, but this is a great way to spend the Sunday evening. So thank you for being here with me, or Sunday morning, wherever you are in the world. Kenobi says hi. Hey, Kenobi. On to section 2, the ideas and the God of Plato. Plotinus would have been surprised at being thought of as the founder of a new school, Neoplatonism. He considered himself a Platonist pure and simple, without prefix or qualification. In other words, as an interpreter and follower of Plato. Plato, in his view, possessed the truth, the whole truth. In his polemic against the Gnostics, he accuses them either of plagiarizing Plato or, when they abandon him, to split hairs and invent new doctrines of departing from the truth. That Plotinus' claim was sincere is not in doubt. However much it may astonish us, finding as we do a different system implicit in the Enneads and also a different spirit from that of the dialogues. Where Plato presents us with the stages of a thought forever inquiring and forever moving beyond itself, Plotinus finds achieved results. Dialectic becomes metaphysics. What was dynamic in Plato takes on the garb of fixity in Plotinus. Though the breath of mystical aspiration, which dominates the Enneads, confers its own powerful impulse upon the whole. The small number of texts, almost all the same, are torn from their context, erected in axioms, which normally has Plato for its subject, and then strung together, often fancifully, are organized to form a body of doctrine. I'm skipping the Greek words here because I don't read Greek, sorry. On occasion, however, Plotinus, falling back into the role of interpreter, can recognize in Plato obscurities, hesitations, contradictions, though only in rare cases is he willing or able to strike out a line of his own. So Plotinus presents himself simply as a interpreter of Plato. He doesn't see himself as founding a new school or doing anything original, but and he criticizes the Gnostics famously for deviating from Plato. But when we do read Plotinus himself, we see something very different in Plato. And the difference that he's pointing out here, the first difference is that while in Plato there is a process, the thought is always moving, is always going higher, ascending. In Plotinus, they achieve some ultimate, they reach their end, they have a certain fixity to them. Interesting. Three essential points of doctrine in Plato are essential also for Plotinus. Subject to important corrections and amplifications, they remain fundamental in the philosophical tradition of the West, whether this tradition has remained Christian or become secularized. If Plato lives on, it is largely in a Platinian context, and therefore with a no accent. If Plato and Plotinus are still alive, it is in a great measure because Christianity, finding a natural ally in Platonic idealism, has taken over its primary doctrines, though not without rethinking them. And we're now going to lay out what the three core principles are of Platonism as echoed through Plotinus, according to Paul Henry. You guys are doing a very good job at responding to each other in the chat, probably better than I can. I'm sure there's a bunch of you that know Plotinus better than I do. But Mackenna asked if Plotinus believes that ascension is a finite journey. Well, he does believe that the soul or the intellect comes to its final rest in the one, although the one itself is infinite. Correct. Plotinus himself experiences that 4 times, according to Paul 3. Okay, what are the 3 doctrines of Platonism that come on Plotinus to remain in the West? First, number 1, there is a clear distinction between the world of eternity and the world of time, between the ideas and the sensible, between here and beyond. This relaxed dualism between time and eternity, ideas and sensible, here and beyond, which is different from radical dualism, whether Gnostic or Manichaean, is later to enter the list again, but through the doctrine of creation to achieve fusion with the relaxed monism, different from pantheism, of Semitic and biblical thought. So that's number 1, is this sense of a relaxed dualism, which is going to join later with a relaxed monism. I like this adjective of relaxed dualist. It's like he's not really too high-strung about his dualism. He's kind of just chilled out, smoking a J dualist. Number 2, Then there is the doctrine going back to Socrates of the immateriality and immortality of the soul. Here again, Christian reflection is almost as much opposed to Plato and Platonism as it is inspired by them. Number three, finally, there's the doctrine of the absolute transcendence of God, located beyond even the ideas and being. Okay, so number one is a relaxed dualism. Number two is the immortality of the soul. And number three is the absolute transcendence of God. On these three dogmas, Christianity and Platonism at once agree and disagree, with the tension between them that would be unthinkable without the existence of a deep-rooted affinity. That's a very nice point, that they can only have serious disagreements if there's a serious basis of agreement for them to be disagreeing on. That's a nice line, that the tension would be unthinkable without the existence of a deep-rooted affinity. What is happening up here? Another dualism. Nice. You guys are having fun. Okay, now we're going to go through all three of these doctrines, and we are going to, sorry, these dogmas, and we're going to spell them out in a bit more length and contrast them with Christian thought as we are doing here. Number one is the relaxed dualism, the chilled out dualism. Number one, the two worlds. The distinction and opposition between the intelligible world and the sensible world, which are nevertheless bound together by participation, is an axiom which Plotinus feels no need to demonstrate, but which he stresses many times over. The intelligible world with the three principal hypostases, which mark, is it hypostases or hypostases? I don't know. Which mark the grades, the one in Seth and Soul, which mark the grades and structure, represent for Plotinus the sphere of the divine realities. All the idealism, all the essentialism of the Christian tradition of philosophy and of the secular metaphysical systems which derive from it is here found in embryo. And neither the creationist doctrine of the East, nor the dogma of the incarnation and of sacramentalism, nor the rediscovery of Aristotle, who brought the forms back into things, will ever prevent the schema from remaining fundamental and inspiring reflection, asceticism and speculative mysticism. Would it be going too far to suggest that Kant's distinction between the phenomena and the noumena, in spite of significant differences, descends from this tradition? He's posing the question, and presumably he thinks the answer is no. This great distinction between the intelligible realm of the divine, of the real, of thought, of the ideas, and the realm of the senses, that which we see, the material world, that fundamental shift, although a relaxed one, so central to idealism and essentialism of all of Western thought as he sees it here, going all the way down to Kant. That is number one. Jeff says yes, that it would be going too far to suggest that. Thank you, M446. Good to have you here with us. Number two, the immateriality of the soul. The belief that the soul is immaterial is far from being shared by all the Greeks. In this respect, Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus are fairly isolated from the main tradition and a long way from the reified materialism which Armstrong calls the pneumatic type of thought. Pneumatic, and which, envisioning the soul as tenuous matter, has representatives through the whole range of Greek thought, from Homer to the Stoics, not to mention the Manichaeans, who were not Greeks at all, and which lingers on in Tertullian. Right, so this notion of the immortality of the soul is not an idea which all the Greeks agree with, but Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, Socrates said earlier, are going to be putting this forward. The Socrates of the Phaedo had taken up the cause of the immortality of the soul. In Plotinus' very first treatise on beauty, one of the simplest and most attractive and undoubtedly the most read of all his works, he focused on hating the essence of beauty, even of sensible beauty, not in symmetry of parts, as the Stoics had done, a modern conception. The Stoics are quite a modern people, but in a non-material principle, in participation in the ideal beauty of the intelligible world. And by this device, the theme of idealism becomes associated with that of relaxed dualism. Let's unpack this a second. So beauty, according to Plotinus, is not for the Stoics some sort of material element, a simple balance of the matter presented to us, but it is that it participates, in a very Platonic sense, participates in the idea of beauty, right? There's the intelligible realm where there is the beauty, and we can participate in that. And in that, this notion of beauty and his idealism ties into the relaxed dualism that we laid out earlier, right? Because there is the realm of ideas, the beautiful, the abstract, the concept of it, and then there's the degree to which we can reflect that or conform to it. His second treatise on the immortality of the soul re-employs once more the Stoics, but also against the Pythagorean doctrine of the soul as a harmony and the Aristotelian theory of the soul as an entelechy, the final telos, the full realization of the thing. The essential theme of the Phaedo, which it justifies by a scholastic discussion of the utter immateriality of the soul, a discussion which contains, as Breher observes, a storehouse of arguments destined to be used by every future spiritualist. Right? So this is a very important point for Plotinus that he's taking from Plato and Socrates, that the soul is not material, the soul is immaterial. And the arguments that he makes for it are going to make their way to continue to resound throughout Western philosophical thought. Fun fact, Plotinus usually refers to the intelligible world as a K, literally just over there. That is a fun fact. Is he saying that because it's close to him, or it's other than him? What are you taking from that fun fact? Every time I stop reading, you think that the internet is flaking out again. It's either me or the internet. At some point, our identities become entwined or just become a manifestation of the internet. Without going so far as to include Aristotle amongst the materialists, Plotinus attacks him vigorously on two grounds. He rejects his doctrine of the soul as the body's form, the entelechy, i.e. the act or actuality of the body, and emphasizes by implications the radical difference between spiritual and physical, a difference which was to dominate very largely the ethical and metaphysical teachings of the Western world up to the time of St. Thomas and the integration of Aristotelian psychology, together with a good deal of Aristotelian ethics, into Christian thought. Along with Plato, Plotinus clings firmly to the personal individuality of souls and their survival after death, at least in the sense that, separated from the body, the soul can receive punishments and rewards in the afterlife. Aristotle, immaterialist though he is far from being equally clear and categorical on this point, as medieval and modern controversies have shown plainly enough. Christian thought will follow Plato and Plotinus in this matter, without however accepting the doctrine of metempsychosis, of reincarnation, which is bound up with a particular conception of time and eternity, of creation and of history, which the biblical revelation found it difficult to assimilate. Similarly, Christianity, like Platonism, will look for absolute standards, indeed often to God's self, for the laws of conduct, whereas Aristotelian empiricism, unless corrected, is inclined to lead towards relativism and scientific humanism, the boogeymen of Western philosophy. Yay, Nemesis is loving the stream and grateful to be here. Grateful to be here. I'm so surprised that 30 people showed up on a Sunday to read with us. This is really delightful. Apparently my audio and video is glitching. I'm sorry that it's glitching. we'll go for, how long should we go for? We've been streaming for almost an hour now. It feels like it's been 2 minutes. Maybe we'll get to the end of the section here, and then we'll call it a night. I could have just switched over my internet to Hotstream, to a hotspot for my phone. That might work better. Let's see. Okay, it's not so bad, according to Mr. Crennan. A vital role is assigned by Plotinus to the experience, the return upon oneself, which is described in the wonderful opening of the treatise 4:8. Often I awaken to myself and escape from the body. Right? So that the self and the body are not identified very clearly. In the equation between contemplation and action, lies the very center of Plotinus's metaphysics. Here beats the very heart of his system. An equation between contemplation and action. Interesting. No doubt, Caleb says they hear me. Awesome. No doubt, the warm feeling of inwardness, which marks the essay on contemplation, 3:8, is common at this period to Neoplatonism, to Gnosticism, and to Christianity, whose affinities have been more and more closely observed in our day, only to make us increasingly aware of their irreducible antagonism. Plotinus is always nearer to Plato than to Aristotle, naturally. His metaphysics, therefore, is not such metaphysics as metapsychology. Interesting. And his theodicy leads not from the movement of the spheres to the unmoved mover, not from above to below, but from the soul's desire to that one which alone can satisfy it. It is from the bottom back up. His starting point is not nature, but soul. The soul is an amphibian, and that is a quote from 4:8. And a traveler reascends through the power of dialect to intellect, and then by process of purification, of utter simplification, arrives at the point of contact with the pure and simple absolute, the one. Yay. It is multivalent in its nature. Without leaving the intelligible world, it makes a constant passage to and fro, and so again descends to consciousness and the world of experience. In contrast to the gospel, Plotinus does not go so far as to conceive the soul in opposition to the world of sin, since in point of fact he recognizes neither sin nor salvation, as we said earlier, but on the other hand, he is without awareness of any true eschatology, and is no more concerned any doctrine of salvation and end of times, and is no more concerned with the doctrine of the resurrection of the body than the Areopagites addressed by St. Paul. He pours scorn upon the Gnostics and by implication upon the Christians, who in this respect were their allies, for making man the center of the universe and the subject of a redemption. But he stands with the Gnostics against the Christians, maintaining that the soul must rely on its own unaided efforts to reach the goal of its destiny. So, for Plotinus, the point, he does not begin with the unmoved mover of Aristotle and work his way down to the spheres. He begins with the soul and its journey to the one, in which it must take, and it is this amphibious being that can go from the intelligible realm into the realm of experience to and fro. But as opposed to the Christians and to the Gnostics, he's not concerned with questions of resurrection and end of days, salvation, and he also doesn't believe that the soul is the center of the universe. It is the one that is the center of reality, and the soul which simply goes to it. But he agrees with the Gnostics against the Christians that the journey of the soul must be undertaken by itself and not by relying upon, in the Christian case, obviously the salvation of Jesus. The equation between contemplation and action, like the gulf between ideal and the actual. Yes, very nice. The longing that draws us through life. that Rumi has. Oh, we just hit an hour on the live stream. Feels like we've been going for mere minutes. Let's get to the end of this this segment, shall we? Another 2 pages or so. How does that sound? How are we feeling? Mackenna says, the Capricorn, Volver Capricorn Sagittarius. If Phaedra asks, if the soul is an aspect of the one, it wouldn't need salvation. Well, that's what you were saying earlier, that it doesn't actually need salvation. It just needs to realize that it is a part of the one, and that's the process of ascent, is that process of realization. Oh, you're very welcome, GR. It's marvelous to have you here with us. Okay, Plotinus' system is never explicit. It is not articulated into theorems, as is the case with Proclus, or into questions as with St. Thomas, but it is throughout implicitly presented as a totality of each particular theme. Its characteristic feature is the intimate conjunction amounting to fusion of two problems, the religious and the philosophical, the problem of the soul, of its actuality, its states, its experiences, and the problem of the world, its objects and their rational explanation. Those two problems are fused together. What is new, even in the doctrine, which is usually considered typically Platinian, of the 3 hypostases, the one, intellect and soul, hypostases, is not the letter but the spirit. It is the notion of making the ideas states of being of the intellect and no longer distinct objects, of bringing the very subject of thought into the intelligible world, of considering the hypostases less as entities than as spiritual attitudes. So this is what he meant before when he said that it is less a metaphysic and more a metapsychology, that the hypostases of the intelligible world are not objects somewhere out there, but they are spiritual attitudes, they are states of mind, states of consciousness, states of being. This theology, and that is the synthesis of the problem of the soul and the problem of the world, is the psyche and the cosmic made as one. This theology is a synthesis of cosmology, cosmos meaning world, and psychogeny, from psyche meaning soul. Synthesis of those two. Without ceasing to obey the commands of reason, Plotinus is, in his most philosophical passages, constantly borne along by a deep mystical impulse. As a result, his religious thought is as much opposed to ordinary representations of the universe in the salvation religions as his philosophical thought is to Greek rationalism. He hardly ever appeals to his own experience when he makes his argumentation, and though he may sometimes adopt the style of the devotional diatribe, we are far removed from the pulsating confessions of St. Augustine, in which philosophical problems and problems of the inner life are inexorably interwoven. The last words of Plotinus, which are not, as has been believed throughout the centuries, a disclosure of his own dying thoughts, but a maxim bequeathed to living as a legacy, sum up and express with his customary perspicuity and tact the one concern of the philosopher and the spiritual director, and these are the last dying words of Plotinus: strive to bring back the God in yourselves to the divine in the universe. And those are the words which make their way onto the back of the book. So that was the second of the 3 primary points in Plato and Plotinus of the immortality of the soul. And the third one is going to be this doctrine of the absolute transcendence of God. And we will read that third one and we will pause on that. and let us see what is happening in this wonderful chat here before we continue. Salvation is more general for intellect education is salvation. That's a nice way of putting it. Reason discovering itself. Nice. Salvation comes from the re-identification of the individual soul with universal one soul. Sort of the definition of mysticism. Nice, yes, a lot of mysticism. A lot of deep mystical themes you're going to see emerging from here. Love your neighbor as yourself is a meditative exercise, no doubt. The cosmology of Platonic idealism still alive in the thinking of mathematicians and informationalist physics and other Western mystics of merit. I like that you wrote other Western mystics in addition to mathematicians. Philip says, I don't think we should consider there to be any aspect to the one, including that the soul is part of it. Because the one has no aspects, it's indivisible, and therefore the soul should not be considered a part of the one. How would you propose that we conceptualize the relationship of the soul and the one? Okay. I saw Philip that you wrote to me here. I also don't know how to. I have to figure out how to join people onto the streaming side of the stream. So, my bad. I should have figured that out before. The point number 3 here is the transcendence of God. Plotinus identifies as a matter of course the good of the Republic and the one of the first hypothesis of the Parmenides from Plato. So he identifies the good in the Republic and the one in Parmenides as one thing. This identification, which in the words of Plato situates the good beyond being and which denies to the one all multiplicity, as Philip was indicating, be it only virtual and logical, a multiplicity of names, attributes, forms, or aspects constitutes the basis of the negative theology, which in Plotinus and in his disciples plays so great a part in the doctrine of God and of the mystical experience. The problem of sources is here particularly difficult. The true thought of Plato on the nature of his God and his religion is still a matter of controversy. Moreover, the philosophers who form the connecting links between Plato and Plotinus are imperfectly known, especially the Middle Platonists, whose works read by Plotinus have since perished. We do not even know what he owed to the inspiration of Ammonius Saccas, his teacher. The problem is nonetheless of considerable importance. The reply which we give to the question of the origin of the Platonian doctrine of the 3 hypostases, the one, the intellect, and soul, largely determines the significance and bearing of this doctrine in the Enneads, and consequently, the extent of Plotinus's real originality and his place in the history of ideas. The question may take either of 2 forms, which must be carefully distinguished from each other. 1, to whom did Plotinus believe himself to be indebted for his doctrine? And 2, to whom was he in fact indebted? In other words, what is the true source of the theory of the 3 hypostases and of the transcendent one? A question which isn't going to be so easy to answer. Joseph Reason says you drop the StreamYard link into this chat and then pin it to the top. But I don't have a StreamYard link. It means I have to do this through StreamYard. I don't think that Plotinus thinks that either the soul or the one requires body, that the benefit of the soul gets from the body he describes in 4.8. Oh, we have a conspiracy theory that there was another Ammonius Saccas. The answer to the first question is perfectly who Plotinus believed his doctrine came from. In one of his very first treatises, and one of the most revealing of all on the three principal hypostases, which Plotinus placed somewhat astutely at the beginning of the theological Ennead, and which is the treatise most often quoted by the fathers of the church. Plotinus explicitly connects the distinction between the one, intellect and soul, with the three ones of the first three hypotheses of the Parmenides from Plato, and asserts emphatically that his doctrine is not new and that it is in complete agreement with Plato, who, he adds, is more precise than the Parmenides of history. Shade. Furthermore, he associates the doctrine thus interpreted with an obscure passage in Plato's second letter, which he often quotes and indeed once misquotes, and in which reference is made to three ranks of preference among the higher realities. By combining these passages, no doubt unwarrantably, with others in the Timaeus and in the well-known passage in the Republic, he 6509b, he obtains his hierarchy of the intelligible world. So that, in a nutshell, is how Plotinus gets his doctrine of the three hypostases from Plato. Plotinus remains consistently faithful to this interpretation and this systematization. In fact, a series of key phrases in the Enneads recalls, by their close and almost word-for-word parallelism, phrases from the first two hypotheses of the Parmenides, but not the third, and the God of Plotinus, in contrast with the intellect, is therefore described with whatever justice to Plato's genuine thought in terms which are Platonic. The one is the one and nothing else. Well, let's see what's happening here. Okay, that's what we're up to. Multiple origins. Philip, we definitely find the idea in Plotinus that the one is everywhere and is the reality in which everything takes place. But in all sections that allude to uniting with the one, he is careful to po. Oh, Philip, you left us hanging there. To point out that it requires letting go of all identities and somehow experience the simple nothingness of the one. Right, so it's not even a question anymore of identifying or identity, right? And even the term experience he's critical of, because he says that experience is implying a separation of experiencer and experienced. So I'm guessing that's why you put experience in quotation marks. Experience is self, says Path of Abraham. And Jeff says, that is my issue, that soul is spirit plus body. I think Plotinus is talking about the spirit as much as separated from the body, I think. It's also interesting the way, I'd be curious to hear what you all think about this, the way which Plotinus describes the relationship between the one and the material world, right? Because in one sense, the one stays the one in the intelligible realm, doesn't descend to the material. They're quite opposite in that sense. And yet, as Philip was saying, that the one is everywhere, and is the reality in which everything partakes. That's a fascinating relationship, which I want to explore a little more with you. We do have a secret collaboration coming out, which some of you or most of you already guessed by now. But Philip is putting together a very, very nice introduction. Am I allowed to say this? Very, very nice introduction to Neoplatonism. And I am very much looking forward to learning from Philip, because when Philip puts it out, he puts it out very clearly, and it is a great gift and benefit to all of us. The one, so I know this is on your mind now. The one, here we are. The one is the one and nothing else. Oh, exactly what we were talking about. Look, this guy read our minds. The one is the one, nothing else. Even to assert that it is, or that it is one, is false. Since it is beyond being or essence, no name can apply to it. It eludes all definition, all knowledge. It can neither be perceived nor thought. It is not in movement, nor is it at rest. It is infinite without limit, and since it has no parts, it is without structure and without form. The second hypostasis, as distinct from the first, which transcends it, is extracted exegetically from the second hypothesis of the Parmenides, and is to this that the and it is to the second hypostasis, which is thought, which is nous, and it is to this that the predicates of being and thought belong. Predicates often contradictory but dialectically combined. The same expressions return, but they were influenced by a new factor. In contradistinction from the one par excellence, intellect is a one in many. The soul being in turn a one and many, the soul being the next hypostasis. It is at once in movement and at rest. Infinite like the one, but infinite in a different way, and for the reason that its essence is broken up into an infinity of parts. That's an interesting point. It's infinite as the one is infinite, but its infinity is broken up into an infinity of parts, whereas the one is not a composite infinity. It is beyond any part compartmentalization or compositeness. Infinity of parts which are each identical with intellect as a whole and which have nevertheless the power of remaining severally distinct. So fascinating the way that he works out the grades of being from the one through thought to the soul, infinite of parts, the one in many, one and many. Fascinating stuff. I see we have almost 35 people here with us. What a tremendous turn up for a reading of an introduction to the Enneads. How wonderful. S. Johnson says you should be careful about terms like spirit and soul. The Greek word usually translated spirit, pneuma, isn't a term of special significance for Plotinus. Thank you for that. That is a term that we get from Christianity and from Hegel. Nothingness doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't exist, more than it is beyond all conception. Right. Oh, such a lovely experience being here with you. Good. Let us continue. We have about a page and a half left, and then we will go. The video is 144p. That is such low resolution. I even hooked up my camera here to stream from. That is terrible. Oh, this terrible internet. I could switch over to my phone's internet, but I'm afraid that I'm gonna throw you guys all off. Should I risk it? What do you say? Should I risk switching across? Let's take a quick vote here. Switch or no switch? What do you say? Until you guys make a vote, I will continue reading. Oh, thank you, Mr. Brennan. I'm here for the great company. Unifying pixels. Terrible. Okay. 1 absolute, 3 hypostases. In the same treatise, 5.1, Plotinus attacks Aristotle's assertion that the first principle, transcendent and intelligible, thinks itself. An assertion which in his view is tantamount to abrogating its primacy. Ram Kitty was sent home from army early to find Zebby. Such a gift. Oh, thank you. Philip, right, or beyond any thingness at all. It's nothing, but it is that nothing which holds the potential for everything. Ooh, that's very poetic. I like that. Don't switch, it's okay. The clarity of appearance is insubstantial to the clarity of the ideas. Oh, you guys are too sweet. Stop. Okay, let's continue. So Plotinus goes on attack against Aristotle for saying that the first principle thinks itself. That would abrogate its primacy. Here Plotinus goes back directly to Parmenides and to his dictum that to think and to be are the same thing, right? The identity of thinking and being. And he is thus able to establish beneath the one, which is their cause, intellect, the intelligible being and essence, all on the same level, right? Because if we were to say that the one is thinking, that would mean the one is also being, because thought of being a one, and we don't want to apply even being to the one, as we said. Right, because it is beneath the one that intellect, intelligibility, being, they're all beneath the one. If he fails to find the identity of intellect and being explicitly affirmed by Plato, he can find it, on the other hand, inferred from the Republic that the ideas are essences. That the ideas are essences can identify the animal in itself of the Timaeus with its own intellect, and proceeding along this road can read into the dialogues what is specifically in Aristotelian doctrine. For, in the last resort, it is without a doubt to Aristotle rather than to Plato that he owes the fundamental principle that the thought par excellence is self-thought, in which intelligence and intelligible coincide. We have here, as is well known, one of the most characteristic descriptions of the unmoved first mover, Aristotle's absolute, the self-thinking thought, which is as indifferent to and as distant and detached from the world of man as is the one of the Enneads. This is such fun stuff. I love this, going into these late philosophers, trying to weave their way between Plato and Aristotle and figure out where exactly they're sitting and who they're taking from what. It's such a fantastic intellectual puzzle to try and figure out. And it's not just a puzzle that's just for curiosity's sake or just for trivia. These, as we understand, becomes the basis of all the Western thought until today. So it's really both fascinating and also important. Let's see what's happening here. Nice metaphor from Colin, that it's empty like a canvas, the space that holds all things. That's very nice. S.C. Johnson, who's been very helpful here, says, one thing that helped me understand Plotinus' talking about the one's non-existence is that being in Platonism is often reserved for the world of the intellect form, which the one precedes. Yes, and that's the point which we're making just now. So its nothingness is at least in part because it precedes all forms / predicates, right? Plotinus is taking us on the path to impersonalism. Oh yes, we're going to see that. We're going to see that issue pop up. Plotinus is underrated. Yes, everyone goes to Descartes for sure. Plotinus is best. Plotinus is our man. Yes, I love this loving on Plotinus here. Good. Mr. Poimanders wants to know what we think of Proclus. What do you guys think of Proclus? Proclus says Philip is brilliant, but I've always preferred the relative simplicity of Plotinus. Nice. If we recall that the soul of the world, the third hypostasis, while being transcendent to the sensible world, is yet the seat of providence, and that it exhibits certain features which remind us of the immanent God of the Stoics, we may be tempted to say that the three Platinian hypostases are, roughly, the three gods or absolutes of the three great philosophers which preceded him. Oh, this is a nice formulation. Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, which always transposed into a Platonic key, though always transposed into a Platonic key and connected rightly or wrongly with entities in the dialogues. The one on this assumption would be, right, so we have three philosophies: Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, and we have three hypostases. We have the one, thought, and the soul. The one on this assumption would be the God of Plato, the good of the Republic, identified with the absolute one of the Parmenides. The thought which thinks itself, and in which being and intellect coincide, would be the first principle of Aristotle. Nice. Lastly, the soul of the world would conjure up certain features of the absolute of the Stoics, the vital principle immanent in the world. So he's trying to figure out where Plotinus is getting his ideas from. And he's making this kind of creative conjecture that the three gods, or the three hypostases rather, which are all part of the divine realm for Plotinus, are each taking an element from Plato, where he finds the one, from Aristotle, where he finds thought, and then from the Stoics, where he finds the soul. Dean Ing is in error historically, philosophically, and theologically. Oh, these are fine words. When he implies that there is in the Enneads virtually three gods and three absolutes. According to Ing, the soul of the world being the god to whom we pray for our temporal needs, the intellect, which is the god of spiritual progress, of eternal life, and of celestial happiness, and the one, which is the ineffable divinity, the Godhead rather than God, of the mystics wrapped in ecstasy. It seems extremely difficult to discover the separation of a single and identical goodness, of a single and identical absolute, either in the writings of the great religious thinkers or in the souls of simple men of faith. It is clear that it is clear that the one is alone the absolute for Plotinus, that it corresponds with whatever or whoever we call God, whether we are philosophers, theologians, or minors. So, what was this guy's name? Paul Henry rejects Dean Ing's reading that there are three gods here and that they correspond to three different parts of our religious and philosophical relationship, that to which we pray, that to which we seek progress, and then that which is beyond all of it. And instead, he's saying that we don't find this distinction. In Plotinus, there's only one absolute, only one God, and that is the one. Nevertheless, it is true that the attributes which Christianity concentrates on a single being, its triune God, with three equal persons, are distributed by Plotinus among the three hypostases, which are at once distinct and unequal. The one being the source of all things, the intellect, the seat of self-thought, and of the unchanging ideas, the soul, and then the soul of the world, the seat of providence, though it is far less a personal and voluntary power than an immanent and necessary order in the evolution of beings and events. So while he's not agreeing with his reading of Ing, he's saying it is fair perhaps to say that that there is, the same way that in Christianity you're going to have these attributes distributed amongst the three persons of the triune God, so too we're going to have these different attributes distributed amongst the three hypostases of Neoplatonism. And this is going to be a theme, obviously, that's going to pop up a lot of philosophers and theologians trying to draw parallels and lines between the Trinity and the tripart structure of Plotinus's intelligible realm. All right, that brings us to section number 3, which is on Aristotle and the Stoics, where he's going to trace individual themes from Plotinus back to Aristotle and back to the Stoics. But we've been going for almost an hour and a half, so maybe we will have a little schmooze here in the chat and then call it a night or a day. Let's see what's happening here. Kenobi says that they loved Linda Johnson's book, The Lost Masters. Nice recommendation. The audio improved when connected to the speakers. Okay. And Johnson agrees with Philip that Plotinus is very specific about not overcomplicating the chain of... Yes, that Plotinus does not want to overcomplicate the chain of hypostases. He doesn't allow it to be multiplied. We're going to see that soon here. That he's very particular on not allowing too many things to slip in to the chain. This is Mackenna's translation, and he certainly did read Greek to make the translation. We skipped. There's an earlier part of the story here. Oh, thank you for the donation, Midar Curtis. That's very. Thank you for the super chat. there was a whole section here on the story of Mackenna himself, a very, very tragic and complex story of how the translation was made and the troubles that went into it. I recommend reading anyone who wants to know more about the translator. Farhan says that there is a commonality of the mystical element. Plotinus' union with one equals theos equals fana equals moksha. What do you think? Yes, these are all the lines of comparative mysticism which we'll be drawing. We may want to not put everything on one equals line, but maybe be a bit more careful with what's equaling what. But certainly, no, it's not Terence Mackenna. That would be great. It's Stephen Mackenna. If Terence Mackenna translated it, that would be a much better book. All right. I feel bad ending here because there's like 30 people here with us reading together, which is hold up book. Okay, I'll hold it up. There's like 30 people here reading with us, which is incredible. But it's an hour and a half. Maybe it's a good time. We'll schmooze a little, answer some questions, and then we'll call it an evening. Tim said, would you consider the three hypostases to have similar functions to some parts of Füsun found in Kabbalah? It's an interesting question. We're kind of the secret's kind of being the cat's been let out of the bag. We're going to be looking at obviously Neoplatonism and Kabbalah and the upcoming collaboration, and we're going to see how some of the early 12th and 13th century Kabbalists draw direct parallels between the first three Sfirot, Keter, Chachma, Bina, with the three hypostases of the one, Nous, and Soul. So we're going to see that being done. And that's something which is made explicit by the Kabbalah. So instead of me answering the question, let's wait until we're going to be releasing that end of December. We'll see what the Kabbalists themselves say about it. Kenobi says, thank you for being here with us. Kenobi, thank you, Jeff. You're most welcome. Thank you, Mr. or Mrs. Johnson, for being here with us. Phaedra, really enjoyed this so far. Lovely company in the chat as well. Yes, you guys have been lovely. Sorry that we had a troll before. We had to kick them out. So many cool people in this community. You guys are the best. You're most welcome. Colin. SC Johnson wants the Gerson translation. This is what we have, but for those that want to get into it, thank you from Kenobi. Thank you from Tim. Ram Kitty, you're most welcome. Have a great night too. Mark says, just wondering exactly, do you have a specific plan schedule for the future of this project? Just wanting to know when to tune in again. Oh, that's a great question. What do you think? I don't know. I didn't really make a plan. Should we do this? Like once a fortnight or once every 2 weeks or something? I don't know. I'd like to get through this. Maybe is once a week too much? I don't know what the idea is. I was a bit nervous to read. I'm not a great reader. I'm a bit dyslexic, but it was really fun to do it with all of you. And you're very sweet and supportive. And it's great fun to go through this. So maybe we will continue. Maybe we'll make a routine out of it. I will. So let's see. Remanders, you're most welcome. GR, you're welcome. Ibrahim, Musa, thank you for being here with us. Noah, catch you next time as well. GR says, let's do it again. Okay. Mr. Crennan says that he likes this informal format and discussion. Good. Okay, I'm glad the fortnight. Once a week would work well for me as well as once a fortnight. Once a week sounds amazing. Yes, thanks to Philip as well for being here. I'm going to try and find a way that we can get Philip to join the live stream because Philip is an awesome friend and a beautiful person, and I'd love to have him share his knowledge and presence with us. Oh, awesome. We're in the same boat. Yes, it's good to get these off the shelf and blow them off and get a bit of read going. Yes, absolutely. Great interlocutor. Yeah. Let's maybe we could try and do this every Sunday. See how it goes. All right. Anyways, I'm gonna have a chat with Philip, see if he can join me and how to make that happen. We'll see. We will continue reading. The introduction is good so far. I hope it's not bad that we're starting with the introduction before we get to the book itself. Then we have this next. There's two introductions. There's this one on Plotinus and his place in the history of thought, by which he means, of course, Christian thought. And then we have this one, which is Plotinus, an introduction. So that one looks great as well. Okay, thank you all for joining us. Thanks for being here. Much love. Keep seeking. Catch you next time. I'll let you know on the channel and in the Discord when the next time is happening. Thank you for being here with us. Much love. And thank you, Plotinus, for your great work. Thank you, all of you. And good night.